The day Dr. Kessler told Burke Langston there was nothing left to do for his son, Burke didn't cry. He'd spent the last 11 months training himself not to. He sat in that small office with its framed diplomas and its view of the Allegheny River, and he listened to everything the doctor said. The scans, the markers, the plateau that wasn't a plateau at all, but a slow-motion collapse. And when it was over, he stood up, shook the man's hand, and walked out into the corridor without a single word. He didn't break until he was alone in the parking garage, 4 levels underground, where no one could hear him. What no one at UPMC knew, what Burke himself couldn't have known that morning, was that 3 miles away, in a small cafe on Penn Avenue with a hand-painted sign and a cracked front step, an 11-year-old girl named Paloma was doing her homework, and Paloma knew something that all the neurologists in Pittsburgh did not. Burke Langston was 56 years old and had built his fortune the hard way. 30 years of Langston Industrial Supply, starting with a single warehouse in the South Side Flats and eventually supplying steel components to manufacturers across 12 states. The Pittsburgh Post-Gazette had called him a self-made man. His competitors called him relentless. His son Caden, 13 years old, and until recently the starting point guard for his middle school basketball team, used to call him Dad in that exasperated, affectionate way that meant he was about to ask a favor. Caden hadn't called him anything in 5 months. The illness had started fast, a fever in October that wouldn't break, followed by confusion, then seizures, then a kind of stillness that no 13-year-old boy should ever know. The diagnosis came in November: severe refractory autoimmune encephalitis, anti-NMDA receptor subtype, complicated by a delayed immune response that had allowed the inflammation to progress further than any treatment could now reach. Burke had flown in specialists from Johns Hopkins, from Mayo Clinic, from a research center in London that specialized in pediatric neurology. The consensus was always the same, delivered in different accents but with the same careful, sorrowful professionalism. We've done everything we can. Dr. Kessler was the best of them, genuinely brilliant, genuinely kind, genuinely out of options. He'd called Burke into his office on a Tuesday morning in late March, and by the time Burke reached that parking garage, he understood, in a way he hadn't let himself understand before, that the medical world had run out of road. He drove to the hospital to see Caden instead of going back to his office. Caden's room on the pediatric neurology floor was quiet in the way hospital rooms always are, a silence that isn't peace but its absence. The boy lay in the bed looking smaller than he had any right to look. He'd been a physical kid, all elbows and energy, the kind of child who knocked things over just by walking through a room. Now he lay with his hands at his sides and his eyes mostly closed, and the only sounds were the monitors and the soft rhythm of his breathing, and Burke's own voice as he pulled a chair close and began to talk. "Hey, bud, Dad's here." He'd read somewhere, a nurse had mentioned it, or maybe it was one of the pamphlets Dr. Kessler's office had left, that hearing was often the last thing to go. That people in states like Caden's could sometimes process voices, even when they couldn't respond. Burke had decided, on the first day his son stopped answering him, to speak as if this were absolutely true. Every visit, every time. He talked about the Steelers' draft picks and whether the Point State Park fountain was going to be fixed before summer and a new exhibit at the Carnegie Museum that Caden had said he wanted to see. He talked about everything and nothing because the silence that would have filled that room otherwise was something Burke could not bear. He was still talking an hour later when his phone buzzed with a message about a deal that needed his signature. He looked at the phone. He looked at his son. He put the phone in his pocket. "I'm not giving up on you," he said quietly. "Whatever they say in those offices, whatever's in those scan results, I'm not done looking. You hear me, Caden? I'm not done." Caden's eyelids didn't move, his fingers didn't stir. Burke stayed until the evening shift change, then walked out into a Pittsburgh spring that felt nothing like spring. He ended up in the Strip District without quite deciding to go there. Just driving, and then parking, and then walking, because the alternative was going home to a house that felt like a museum to the life they used to have. The Strip was alive the way it always was, produce vendors pulling their last carts inside, the smell of roasting coffee drifting from the shop on Smallman, the sound of someone's radio from an upper floor. Burke walked without direction, hands in his coat pockets, looking like a man who had misplaced something important and couldn't remember where he'd last seen it. He ducked into a small cafe near the corner of Penn Avenue because it was warm, and he was suddenly aware that he'd forgotten to eat lunch. The place was narrow and family-run, with mismatched chairs and a handwritten menu above the counter. A woman in her 50s sat behind the register watching a telenovela on a small screen. In the back corner, a girl sat alone at a table with a math textbook and a bottle of water and the concentrated expression of someone who takes homework seriously. Burke ordered coffee. He sat near the window. He stared at nothing. After a few minutes, he became aware that the girl was watching him. She was maybe 10 or 11, with thick dark hair pulled back in a braid that had come partially loose, and eyes that were calm and direct in a way that didn't fit her age. She wore a school sweatshirt that had seen a lot of washes and sneakers with a strip of duct tape holding the right sole together. When Burke noticed her looking, she didn't look away. "You're sad," she said simply. Burke blinked. "I'm sorry. You've been sitting there for 7 minutes and you haven't touched your coffee." She tilted her head slightly. "My mom says when people forget their coffee, something's really wrong." Despite everything, Burke felt something loosen in his chest, just slightly. "Your mom sounds smart." The girl paused. "Is it your son?" The words landed like something physical. Burke set down the cup he'd finally reached for. "What did you just say?" The girl closed her textbook and folded her hands on top of it. "I've seen you before, at the hospital. I wait for my mom there sometimes after school. She works on the neurology floor." She said it without embarrassment, just as fact. "You come every day. You always look the same way when you walk out." "And how is that?" "Like you already know the answer," she said quietly. "And you hate it." He was quiet for a long moment then. "What's your name?" "Paloma. Paloma Reyes." She stood, picked up her textbook and her water bottle, and moved to the chair across from him without being invited. "My mom's name is Carmen, and I think I know something that might help your son." Burke had heard those words before. He'd heard them from alternative practitioners and wellness centers and researchers who had reached out after his situation became known in certain circles. He'd investigated every one of them. None had offered anything real. But there was something about this child, the stillness of her, the complete absence of any performance, that made him stay in his seat. "Tell me," he said. Paloma Reyes had been 9 years old when she stopped being able to move. She told it the way children tell things they've survived, with a matter-of-factness that is more devastating than any drama. The fever, the hospital, the diagnosis her mother had to look up because the doctor said it too fast, and Carmen's English, while good, sometimes struggled with medical terminology in moments of shock. The weeks in that same neurology ward where Caden now lay. The specialists who used slightly different words to deliver the same message. "Dr. Kessler told my mom I had less than a 5% chance of any meaningful recovery," Paloma said. "And even that wasn't because of anything medicine could do. He said if it happened, it would be spontaneous." Burke felt the name like a cold hand on his shoulder. "Dr. Kessler, he was your doctor?" "For 8 months." "And you recovered?" Paloma looked at him with those unhurried eyes. "I'm sitting here, aren't I?" Burke leaned forward. "Paloma, if you had a documented recovery from this condition, you'd be in the medical literature. Dr. Kessler would have published your case. It would be." He said my grandmother's methods were a coincidence. There was no bitterness in her voice, just the simple accuracy of someone reporting a fact they've had time to make peace with. He said whatever my mom did at home didn't cause the recovery. He said the disease probably ran its course on its own. A pause. He changed my chart to say the original diagnosis may have been overstated. "That's not possible. You can't overstate the markers for this condition. My mom has all the scans, all 3 from when I was sick, and the one they did a year later when she took me to a different doctor." Paloma's hands were still folded on her textbook. "They match. The inflammation pattern, the receptor markers, everything. Dr. Kessler knows they match. He just doesn't want it to mean what it means." Outside, a delivery truck made its slow way down Penn Avenue. The woman behind the register had turned off the television. The cafe felt very still. "What did your mother do?" Burke asked. "What were these methods?" "My abuela, my great-grandmother. She came from a small town in Puerto Rico. She learned healing from her mother, who learned from hers. Pressure points along the spine and the base of the skull. Herbal teas from specific plants, she said, could help the brain reduce inflammation from the inside. Sound therapy, certain low frequencies almost below what you can really hear. And movement. Every single day, my mom would move my arms and legs through specific patterns, even when the doctors said my nervous system could register anything. Paloma paused, and she talked to me constantly, even when I couldn't answer. She said I needed to know that there was a path out, and she was going to keep describing it until I found my way back to it. Burke's throat was tight, and it worked. Paloma smiled, and it was the first real smile Burke had seen on anyone in a very long time. "I'm sitting here, Mr. Langston, I keep telling you." Carmen Reyes was 38 and had the kind of quiet authority that belongs to people who have been through the worst possible thing and come out the other side with their dignity intact. She met Burke the following evening at a diner on Liberty Avenue, a public place, her choice, and he respected it completely. She brought Paloma's medical file in a manila envelope held shut with a rubber band and set it on the table before she sat down. "I've thought about this since Paloma told me she spoke to you," Carmen said. She had her daughter's directness, or Paloma had hers. "I want to be honest about what I can and can't promise." "Please," Burke said. "I can't promise a recovery. I don't know if Caden's case is like Paloma's. The disease presents differently in different people." She folded her hands around her coffee cup. "What I can tell you is what I did and what happened, and you can decide what to make of it." Burke opened the envelope. The scans were dense with imaging data he couldn't fully read, but had seen enough of in the past 5 months to understand. The markers were unmistakable. So was the later scan, showing a brain that had, against every recorded expectation, returned to something that should not have been possible. "Why didn't you fight harder to have this recognized?" he asked. "With records like these." "I clean hospital floors," Carmen said simply. "Dr. Kessler is Dr. Kessler, no self-pity in it. I tried. I wrote letters. I contacted 2 medical journalists. One never responded. The other said the story wasn't scientifically strong enough without Dr. Kessler's cooperation." She lifted her cup. "I don't have the resources to fight that kind of resistance, but you might." "I'm not asking for money," she added quickly. "I'm asking for the chance to try to help your son. If it works, maybe someone with your name can make sure this doesn't stay buried." That night, Burke sat for 3 hours in his home office, staring at the window. He thought about what his medical team would say. He thought about Dr. Kessler. He thought about Caden's hands lying still against the hospital sheets, and the monitors counting off each breath with such indifferent precision. Then he thought about Paloma Reyes, 11 years old, duct tape on her sneaker, doing her homework alone in a corner cafe. Alive, fully, unmistakably alive. He called his attorney at 7 in the morning and told her he was bringing his son home. The northeast wing of the Langston House in Fox Chapel became, over the next 48 hours, a fully equipped medical suite, a respiratory team, round-the-clock nursing staff. Dr. Kessler came to see Burke before the transfer was finalized and stood with his arms crossed and his jaw tight. "You're making a mistake," he said. "Not because of the girl's claims, though I'd strongly advise against placing medical weight on a single anecdotal case. 3 neurologists confirmed her original diagnosis," Burke said. "Diagnoses are revised. That's how science works." "Not like this one." Kessler looked at Caden for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge. "I understand why you're doing this, but I've built my career on evidence. What you're describing is the opposite of evidence." "My son is 13 years old and he hasn't spoken in 5 months," Burke said. "And a girl who was in this exact room 2 years ago helped me find a diner on Liberty Avenue without hesitating for a second." He met the doctor's eyes. "Come visit him in a month. Tell me then what's evidence and what isn't." Kessler left without making any promises. Carmen came every morning at 7 and every evening at 5. She brought canvas bags that the nursing staff regarded with professional wariness, dried herbs in cloth pouches, small bottles of essential oils, a portable speaker, a set of smooth wooden tools she used for the pressure point work. The first thing she did at every session was change the room. She brought a photograph of Caden at his last basketball game and placed it where he could see it if his eyes opened. She brought a Steeler's blanket and laid it across the foot of the bed, replacing the institutional white. She swapped the overhead fluorescents for warmer lamps and set the speaker to play a sequence of low frequencies, barely sound at all, more like the memory of sound. He needs to know he's still in a world he recognizes, she told Burke and the skeptical night nurse with equal calm. Not a medical facility, his life. Paloma came after school. She would sit cross-legged at the foot of the bed and talk to Caden the way she might talk to any kid her age. About basketball, about a video game that was coming out, about the time she'd tried to teach herself to do a cartwheel in the parking lot of her apartment complex and ended up sitting in a puddle. She didn't talk at him. She talked to him in the particular tone of someone who is completely confident they are being heard. 2 of the nurses quietly began timing her visits. On the 9th day, Burke was alone with Caden in the late afternoon, talking about a fishing trip they'd planned the previous summer. One of those conversations that lived in the future and required Caden to be there. He was mid-sentence when he stopped. Caden's index finger had moved. Almost nothing, less than half an inch. But Burke had held that hand every single day for 5 months, and he knew, the way a parent simply knows, with a certainty that has nothing to do with evidence, that it was not random. He leaned forward slowly and said very quietly, as if speaking louder might undo it, "Caden, can you hear me?" The finger lifted again. Burke pressed the call button 4 times. By the time the nurse arrived, Caden's entire hand had shifted against the sheet, deliberate, unmistakably intentional. The EEG showed increased activity in the motor cortex. The independent neurologist Dr. Burke's team had brought in, a woman named Dr. Patel, who had a reputation for careful thinking, stood over the readouts with an expression she couldn't quite make neutral. "This is unexpected," she said. "Call Carmen," Burke told his assistant before anyone else could say anything, "and call Paloma." They came within the hour, Carmen with her quiet certainty, Paloma with her backpack still on one shoulder. The girl went directly to Caden's bedside. She took his hand in both of hers and leaned close. "Hi, Caden. I'm Paloma." Her voice was as steady as her eyes always were. "I was in this same bed 2 years ago. I know how far away everything feels right now, but I found my way back, and I want to help you find yours." The room was completely silent. Caden's fingers curled, slowly, incompletely, but with visible effort around Paloma's hand. Burke turned toward the window so no one would have to watch his face. The days that followed were not a straight line. There were mornings when Caden seemed to retreat, when the monitors reported nothing new, and the room felt heavy again with waiting. Carmen had told them to expect this. She said the nervous system didn't heal the way a broken bone heals. It found its way back along paths that had to be rebuilt one increment at a time, and sometimes the path was steep. But then there were other mornings. The day Caden's eyes opened fully and tracked the basketball photograph on the wall, staying with it for almost a minute. The afternoon when Paloma asked him to blink once if he could hear her, and he did. Once, deliberately, with an effort that was visible in his whole face. The evening the respiratory therapist removed the breathing tube for a brief test, and Caden drew 3 breaths on his own, and the third was stronger than the first. Burke was alone with Caden the morning it happened. He'd been talking about the fishing trip again. It had become a kind of ritual, that particular future, that specific imagined morning on the Yohiogeni, with sandwiches and bad luck, and the particular easy silence that fathers and sons sometimes find outdoors. He was mid-sentence when the sound came. Barely a sound, more breath than voice. "Dad." Burke stopped. The word came again, slightly stronger, working its way out of a throat that had been still for months. "Dad." He couldn't answer right away. He held his son's hand and felt everything he'd been compressing for 11 months rise at once. The parking garage, the scan results, the long, terrible evenings talking to a boy who couldn't answer, every moment of hope he'd forced himself to put away, every promise he'd made and hadn't known if he could keep. When he finally spoke, his voice was not steady, and he didn't try to make it so. "I'm here, bud. I've got you. I'm right here." Caden's eyes found his father's face. There was recognition in them. Not the reflexive response to stimuli that doctors catalogued in their notes, but the simple, irreducible thing that happens when one person sees another person and knows them. He had been in there all along. Through every scan and every verdict and every long afternoon of talking into silence, he had been there, listening, waiting, finding his way back inch by inch. Dr. Kessler came at Burke's invitation 3 weeks after Caden first spoke. He arrived early, went straight to the medical suite, and spent 2 hours conducting a methodical examination. Burke waited in the hallway with Carmen and Paloma, the three of them standing in the particular quiet of people who have been through too much to fill silence unnecessarily. When the doctor emerged, his face was not quite readable. His cognitive responses are consistent with significant neurological recovery, Kessler said. He was looking at the floor when he said it, then made himself look up. The MRI I ordered him shows reduced inflammation in regions I would have considered permanently compromised 2 months ago. And your conclusion? Burke asked. Kessler was quiet for a moment. I don't have one, not a complete one. That's an honest answer. He turned to Carmen, and something shifted in his expression that might have been the beginning of professional humility. I'd like to review your protocol. The sequence, the materials, the timing. I'm not prepared to attribute Caden's improvement to your methods, but I'm no longer. Another pause. I'm no longer prepared to say it's impossible. Carmen met his gaze without triumph, without any satisfaction at all. Then come back next week, she said simply, and the week after that. The Langston Foundation for Neurological Innovation was announced 4 months later. Burke stood at a podium in a downtown Pittsburgh hotel conference room and spoke about what his son had taught him. About the limits of certainty, about knowledge that lives outside of institutions, about the obligation he felt to make sure no other family had to discover these things as late as he had. Dr. Patel spoke about integrative case documentation and the importance of open inquiry. Carmen spoke last briefly, in the careful English she used in formal settings, and said only that she hoped Paloma would grow up in a world where what her grandmother knew was treated as a compliment to medicine rather than a challenge to it. Paloma sat in the front row and watched, and when her mother finished speaking, she reached over and squeezed the hand of the boy sitting beside her. Caden Langston, 14 years old, wearing a Steelers hoodie and a lopsided grin, squeezed back. He was still using a cane. He'd need it for another few months, the therapist said. His left hand was slower than his right, and there were mornings when words took longer to find than they should. But he was in the front row. He was squeezing someone's hand. He was there, entirely and undeniably there. After the press conference, a reporter stopped Burke in the hallway and asked what he would say to other families facing the kind of prognosis he'd once received. Burke thought about the parking garage. He thought about the moment 4 floors underground when he'd finally let himself break. He thought about a girl with a duct-taped sneaker and a math textbook she'd set aside to walk across a cafe and sit down, uninvited, across from a man she could see was drowning. I'd tell them to keep looking, he said, not because the answer is always out there, but because sometimes it is, and sometimes it comes from exactly the person the system has decided doesn't matter. He paused. Pay attention to those people. Sometimes they're the ones who know. 6 months after that, on the first Saturday in October, Burke drove to Homewood and parked in front of the row house where Carmen and Paloma lived. He'd been invited for dinner, an occasion Paloma had apparently organized with the enthusiasm she applied to most things, which was considerable. Caden came with him, walking without the cane now, slower than before his illness but steadier every week. He'd been calling Paloma his best friend since August, which still struck Burke as one of the more quietly extraordinary facts of the past year. Carmen opened the door before they knocked. The smell of something wonderful came from the kitchen. Paloma appeared behind her mother with a grin that had grown no less direct and no less unsettling since the first time Burke had sat across from it in that cafe on Penn Avenue. You're late, she told Caden. 3 minutes, he said. I'm very precise about these things. He laughed. It was a sound Burke still could not hear without something catching in his throat. Not grief anymore, just the raw and overwhelming gratitude of a man who had sat in a parking garage in March and believed he was looking at the end of something, and had been wrong. Inside, the table was set, the food was ready, the evening was just beginning, and across town at the Langston Foundation's new research center on 5th Avenue, a photograph was already pinned to a corkboard. Two children standing outside the building in the autumn sunlight, squinting into the glare, both of them grinning. Below it, in Paloma's careful handwriting, 3 words. We found it.